right. Good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is, I'm just going to start with um, today's Grow session, which is entitled Jewish Teaching for the End of Life with Rabbi Allison Berry. Just so you know, my name is Laura Tarlin, and I am one of the program and relationship directors on the Tamid of Hebrew College team. Grow sessions are designed to be opportunities for participate to gather, reflect, observe, and wrestle with important topics relevant to our lives today through a Jewish lens. While many in our society avoid talking about death, the Bible speaks about it openly. Ecclesiastes reminds us that there is a time to be born and a time to die. Jewish tradition understands death as a human reality, marked by loss, love, and memory, and offers meaningful structure for caring for one another at the end of life. These teachings can help us live with a greater depth and compassion and offer insight into topics like relationships, memory, and end-of-life care. I am so honored today to introduce our speaker, Rabbi Allison Berry. Allison is honored to serve as the director of the Betty Ann Greenbaum Miller Center for Jewish Healing at Jewish Family and Children's Services. She is passionate about her work supporting members of the Jewish community and beyond who are on their journey through many stages of grief and healing. Prior to joining JF&CS, Rabbi Berry served for many years as a congregational rabbi, most recently as the co-senior rabbi of Temple Shalom in Newton. Rabbi Berry is a graduate of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and Brandeis University. She is proud to be the past chair of the Newton Interfaith Clergy Association and volunteers as a trained court mediator for Metro West Mediation Services, and also serves as one of our instructors here at Tamid. So I'm really excited to introduce her, and I'm going to turn it over to Alice.
Wonderful. And good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. And Laura, thank you so much for everything you've done to make this class happen. And just a quick shout out to any of my former members at Temple Shalom. What a privilege to be able to study with you again and with everyone else here. A little bit about me before I get started, and that I think Laura shared. I was a congregational rabbi for many years, and as we know, a lot of that work has to do with grief and loss, bereavement. I've officiated at hundreds of funerals. A few years ago, I decided I wanted to focus on mental health and spend more time in my work really accompanying people at life's challenging moments. And I've been very blessed for the past year and a half to be working at Jewish Family and Children's Service. And it's just an incredible organization. And the majority of my work there focuses specifically first on grief and bereavement. I oversee and run all sorts of different types of bereavement groups and work with a team. And then the other piece is to bring resources, better community resources to synagogues is the other piece of the work that I do. And so I'm really just honored to be a part of this. The idea of this Lunch and Learn today is that we're going to be talking together, but then the goal will be that we're moving into a longer class in the spring that can go much more in depth into many of these ideas. So just to get us started, I want to share a quick frame. And I think that we as a society, we don't often give ourselves permission to think about death. We soften the language. We maybe say someone's passed. We avoid the conversation. We tell ourselves there'll be time later. Or we just don't want to upset our family members, our parents, our friends by bringing up the topic. And so this question the fact that our life will end, it just sits underneath so much of what it means to be human, and yet we don't develop a great vocabulary around having this conversation. I think what's striking about Judaism, and as we're going to see over the course of the next hour, is that Judaism is not particularly focused on what happens after we die. Its deepest concern is how do we live knowing that life does end? How do we live well or meaningfully in a world that's uncertain, knowing that everything is finite? And as our history of a people has taught us over and over again, we know that life is fragile. And so what do we do with that? And so to live Jewishly, I think, is to really live on multiple levels, to cherish the gift of life and to hold this memory and idea that life can't be taken for granted. And so I'm hoping today will begin a conversation, not end one. We'll open the door a little bit wider to expand our language for speaking about what end of life means and meaning making. And in those moments, what happens, what matters most. So just know that what I've done today is I brought us 5 key texts from Jewish tradition that I think are good to be seen as 5 frames into a much larger doorway to think about death, mourning, and bereavement. That's a lot to cover. And so just know that we're going to barely really skim the surface of each one and each idea and topic, knowing we can go more in depth in the spring. But before we do that, I do want to just put one more thing out there, knowing this is not a light conversation for lunchtime. And I'm assuming that each of us who comes here today comes to this conversation with our own personal history. Maybe it's grief or fear or even trauma. Curiosity, is there some resistance as well? And all of those emotions are welcome. I want you to be here and to show up with all of them. The one thing I do ask is that because most of us don't know each other, is that let's be gentle and kind, knowing that each of us has a different history and reason that we're here. Some of what we look at today may resonate for you, other parts of it might not. Parts may bring up memories, they may bring up feelings. And the one thing I again want to say is if they do, please reach out after class. You are not alone and holding on to lots of this. There are resources in the community that are available to help and to be a support. None of us are alone in this struggle. So I just wanted to really begin from that place. And so now what I want us to do, I'm going to share my screen because we are going to work from slides today. Sometimes I'll move off those slides so we can see each other as well. The goal is for this to be much more discussion based than maybe we usually do with these grow sessions. I'm not somebody who likes to stand up and lecture completely for an hour. And so we're going to use the chat. We may use some breakout rooms. There may be some times where I'll invite people to raise their hands and call on a few people, not everybody all the time, just because there's so many of us and we do have an hour. But I hope that you'll be here and be ready to have a conversation as much as you're comfortable, and to know that this is only a beginning. So I do want us to start with the blessing for Torah study because we are going to be looking at some sacred texts today. If you know the blessing, please stay on mute, but share the words with me out loud. We'll just mark this moment Jewishly. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who has commanded us to soak up, to bring deep these words of Torah that we will study today. Amen. So I want us to open first with a question, just to hopefully get us a little more comfortable with even being able to talk about this topic. And so you're welcome to put in the chat. What's one thing you've always wondered about Judaism and death, whether it's ritual or emotional or theological about God or something ethical? Just to get out there what you come here today with. We may not be able to get to all those questions, but I'd love to get a sense of who you are and what you bring. So just take a moment, throw anything you want into the chat. Just waiting to see. And I see 2 so far. Do Jews believe in an afterlife? What is it about that afterlife we believe in? Assisted end of life, that question of MAID, which is really sweeping many states in the country. It's a huge conversation. I absolutely agree. Messianic wondering, right? Jewish rituals, how to better honor death as a life cycle moment, most definitely. About
Hi, I'm
judgment.
trying to figure out where the chat is on the I'm on an iPhone.
Sure. So if you go to the bar at the bottom, across the bottom of your screen, you'll see that it says chat, or maybe on the side, I think. I don't have this on my phone right now.
It may be under the dot, dot, dot that says more.
I have a new iPhone, and there's 3 dots at the bottom.
So I see other pieces, ethical decision making, questions about cremation, what happens to the soul, a question around our ancestors and accompaniment, about Jewish rituals in it when we're in a secular place too.
Is someone available to help me with this, to get on?
I'm not sure. If one of the staff may be able to message you, but I'm not 100% sure in this moment.
Debbie, maybe just listen and soak it in.
And a question around ritual funerals within 24 hours. So lots and lots of questions. I'm making note of these. We're not necessarily going to answer every single one today, but my hope in the spring is to take all of these and also to then build out our class around it, because I think that there's just so many dimensions to this topic. But the texts we are going to look at a few different areas that you have brought up, because I think so many of these are so important and the biggest ones when we think about loss and death. So to move us to our first understanding, and this is a gorgeous text from Psalms that I want to use as sort of a bigger picture frame around everything else that we're going to look at today. And we read from Psalms, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And I think ultimately just a true and deep reminder that life is finite, and that we live in the shadow of that, and that every single day should matter. And that's an incredible ask of us in the world, right? To live as each every day mattered, as each every day could be the last. And I think in some ways such an impossible task as well. But I just want us to keep this in the back of our mind as we go through the rest of these pieces today, that ultimately what matters most to us when we get to these moments and we think about loss and we think about what happens at the end. So we're going to dive into our first text today in a deeper way that we're going to spend some time on. And so I want to create a frame to say this is really, I think, one of the most significant death scenes in the Hebrew Bible at the very end of the book of Genesis. We have our forefather we have our forefather Jacob, who's the end of that line of our patriarchs and matriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. And we know from the book of Genesis that Genesis is filled with rivalry and family conflict. And we're taught this in this very beautiful moment at the end of this text. What Jacob does is something very interesting, and that his sons, who have been estranged in some ways, they're the ones that go on to form the tribes of Israel. He calls them together. And he says, gather yourselves, that I may tell you what shall befall you in days to come. And that entire last section of Genesis then goes on to be about his predictions for what it is that his children may experience in the years ahead. We get to the very end of the chapter, and this is where we see what I find to be a significant line, both in Hebrew and in English. And I'm going to ask everybody in a minute to maybe respond to this a little bit. So what we're told about Jacob's death was that when he's finished instructing his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And that's it. It really says no more. So we have very limited language here to know what to do with that does describe Jacob's death. So that's hard. So I want to ask a few questions that maybe you can respond to in the chat. I'm going to invite some people to maybe raise their hands too. I'll call on a few of us. But first, what do you take this to mean that the Torah is saying? What is the Torah saying here about death? And what are for you some questions that are really brutally, I think, in some ways, left unsaid? If you want to raise your hand and I can call on you, or if you want to share something in the chat, that would be great. And I'll give everybody a minute and I'll see if there's hands raised. What do you think? So does it say he knew the future, including the time of his death? So thinking about Jacob, so I think one question is, did he know he was going to die? One piece that's on here, passing on the importance of tradition in the next generation. Andy, I see that, and then Myrna, I see you both have your hands raised if you wanted to share. First Andy, then Myrna.
Um, I'm wondering about the phrase was gathered to his people. I don't know if that implies an afterlife or what does it imply?
It's really interesting, right? It is. It doesn't, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit too. The word met for death isn't being used here. It's vayigva in the Hebrew, and we'll talk about that word in a minute, because it really is so interesting, right? A gathering versus a death. So what do we do with that, right? Big question. Myrna. Oh, if you want to unmute.
Thank you. I also noticed the gathering twice, and the first time it's an invitation, gather yourselves together, and it's the father to the children. But the second time, I see two things. One, that him drawing his feet into the bed and breathing his last was a kind of a handing over and becoming part of. In other words, the tradition always teaches, to me, always teaches us that we go on together, and we don't necessarily leave each other, that we're all connected. It's about, to me, it's about interconnection. And but I think especially the second line is
I guess I'll.
finality of it. He drew his feet into the bed, and that is it. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So there's a gathering, and then with this sort of beautiful sense of I want to share with my children and family ethically or predictively what matters to me. And then also this drawing inward, this pulling his feet in, right? And so it's both, which is just a very interesting image, right? Howard, your hand is raised.
Thank you. So obviously it's important that Jacob reveals this blessings and futures to his sons. What I'm wondering about is obviously he's in an advanced age. We don't know how long we're going to live, really. And he could have died for a million reasons in the last 20, 30 years. He could have had an accident, could have been murdered, could have gotten sick and died. He's waiting till he thinks he's about to die to do this. And I'm like, how could he know for sure he'd live long enough to do that?
And so it's problematical on the other hand, right? As we think about, we don't necessarily know when it is that our lives may come to an end. So he had time here in some way to do these things that many of us may not. So this isn't ideal of a situation on some level, right? So another question, if this is very terse as well, if you were going to add one thing to this story, or there was something you wouldn't want it to say, so the opposite to what's something that you might add to this that you for yourself would want to know as we're envisioning this scene? Anyone else? What's something you might add, or what's something you wouldn't want it to say that you're glad it's terse about? The reaction of the children. Yep, that's Abby just said. That I'd like to know how the kids reacted in this moment. Carol.
Also, the second line, when Jacob finished instructing his sons, says to me, he finished his work, and then he drew his feet into the bed and died. And so I wish it said more explicitly, about meaning and purpose, and when somebody feels that that has been fulfilled, and is ready to leave because they have, quote, instructed their sons.
So absolutely. And I think also looking at the chat, he doesn't offer them love, which actually does, right? It's very, very academic on some level, that might be missing here. And that what Lisa says in the chat, I think too, I'm glad he didn't say anything because everyone has a different final script. So actually leaving it terse leaves each of us open to our own understanding of what it could say. This, in the gathered to his people, is it symbolic? Is it literal? Gathered to whom? To where? So many questions, right? So the rabbis also, when I say the rabbis, what I mean is the classic rabbis of the Talmud, which is the next layer after the Torah, really from 200 to maybe 800 CE. Not that we don't have a lot to say. The rabbis also had a tremendous amount to say about this because it's so terse, right? What do we do with it? And they, again, going back to that question of gathered and that Hebrew word, what does it mean? So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I do think what I was hearing from many of you first, and this is actually a beautiful painting that actually is this scene in the Torah. This is some artist's depiction of this. But we see an attempt to make repair. We see a blessing across the generations. And we see that he's being practical, right? Giving directions about what it is that he wants. And then I think this question of leaving clarity instead of confusion. So again, in an ideal moment of loss or death, he's doing all these things. What a gift on some level. And in one line, we're sort of gathering all of that, which is this unbelievable thing as well, right? Some kind of a Dewey, Lori Minland's bringing up, is there a confession here as well? And so there's just so much. So now what are the rabbis going to do with this? I think is sort of the next set of questions. They're going to take this a step further because they are actually, again, going to be very interested in this word, vayigva, that being gathered to his people. And so we read in the Talmud that Rabbi Yochanan responds to this line, and he actually says something interesting. He says, Jacob, our father, did not die. And so the other rabbis are baffled, right, by a comment like this. What are you talking about? He did not die. And they said to him, but he was eulogized. He was embalmed. He was buried. And Rabbi Yochanan responds, just as his descendants are alive, so he too is alive. So something interesting is at play here on multiple levels, right? What we know is he's responding to the lack of the word met, the word for death. And he is responding to the idea that this vayigva is here instead. What could he be getting at? What do you take all this to mean? And again, chat or hand raise, whatever makes it the most sense for you. What are the rabbis doing here? What do you think? We live on through our children, which is a very sort of very through line in Jewish practice. As long as your ancestors are talking about you, you're being kept alive. I see somebody, it says Blankster, and I'm going to invite you to unmute.
You opened this discussion talking about the lack of emphasis in the Jewish religion on what happens after death. Mm-hmm. Yet here so early in the Torah, we find the same word being used for an actual physical gathering of live people, and what happens to Jacob on his physical death. And I'm wondering whether there was a time at which the Jewish religion did look to a life after death. Mm-hmm. And whether that was something we dropped in conjunction with the growth of Christianity and its thinking on that.
Mm-hmm. So it's a huge question, that question of what happens after we die, that actual life after death. Um, I don't want to jump deeply into that today, but know that we will explore that in the spring because it is a huge question. I think in this case, the rabbis are getting at something else. They're not really talking theology here, in some ways. But there's definitely a concept of afterlife in some circles in Judaism, and then in others, it's less so, less of an emphasis. Here, though, that we're talking about life in some very interesting kind of way. So I see Ellen saying, is it a failure, a refusal to mourn someone very beloved, right? Is this a denial? Is it that someone's teachings are a legacy that lives on? Is it someone's children? Is it good deeds that can instruct those who are left behind? Karen, if you wanted to jump in.
Sure. Hi. Here's how I read this. What Rabbi Yochanan said is that okay, Jacob, his body died. He was eulogized, embalmed, and buried. But I feel the next sentence about the descendants are alive and he too is, and I say it just from my own personal experience, the important people in my life are still with me, very much with me. My grandmother, she died almost 30 years ago. She was so important to me. And she's come, she visits me when I garden. She gardens, so I'm in the garden with her. Or if I still have little odds and ends of hers, and when I pick them up, I think of her. When people, so I feel like she's alive in me. And the same would be true of my parents. They're alive in me. And so to that end, it feels very real to me. And that's what I think Rabbi Yochanan was getting towards. They're not physically at the table, but they're spiritually at the table.
And Karen, I love everything about that and what you just said. And thank you for sharing about your grandmother as well.
You're welcome.
I have this vision now of you gardening and her there. I think it's so apt. I really do. This idea of our relationship continuing with somebody after they're gone, right? The physical death, does that mean our relationship with a loved one has to end? And I very much think that this is part of what the rabbis are getting at. They're differentiating between a physical death of the body and something else. That is it more metaphysical, or is it a continuation on of relationship? And we're going to look at that in a modern context too in a minute, because it's exactly, I think, where I went as well. And so I did have some sort of questions, some centering questions here. But I think for me, the one to ask too is Rabbi Yochanan trying to comfort us, or is he asking something of us? From this statement is also one thing I'll put there, because to me, the question is, we look at a text like this, and now what is it telling us to do? What is it telling us for how we should act as well? And I see Amy said that saying Kaddish is a comfort, right? And these rituals of how somebody does stay alive, and I'm using that word, right, really meaningfully for us, even if they're physically not here. What do you think? What is this a comfort, or are we being asked to do something? Anyone have either a hand raised? What about people who do not have descendants, right? Do not have children? And so to me too, when I look at this, I say I use descendant. Personally, I like to broaden it, right? People were talking about teachings or lessons, or blessings. Annette, your hand is up. And I can ask you.
Well, I guess my sentiment is similar to Karen's. I quote my grandmother. I don't have children, but I quote my grandmother all the time to my nieces and nephews and my great nieces and great nephews. And I even quote my great grandmother, who I never knew, because my grandmother and my mother and my uncle told me stories about her. So she is very much alive to me because I know so many stories about her. And I've seen pictures of her, and I feel like I know who she was, and I feel a responsibility to keep her alive for the next generations. And my grandmother, who my nieces and nephews never knew, is certainly a part of their lives.
Mm.
And
I
so
love-
is so are I had the gift of knowing all my grandparents, and I feel a responsibility for my nieces and nephews to know who my grandparents were.
It's beautiful.
And it's easy because I love them all and they loved me. So I talk about them all the time. And like Karen, they are with me all the time in things I do.
And so that word, right, Yochanan asking something of us, that there is a responsibility, although it's a beautiful, for many, for those of us where it was a beautiful relationship, it's a beautiful responsibility, right, of bringing that person into the world. When we hear about a death, the word zichrono livracha, may a person's memory be a blessing. If you may have heard that phrase before, for me at least, this is the origin text for it on some level, right? How is a person's memory a blessing? It's when we vayigva, we gather, right? We gather what they gave to us or taught us about who we are today, about the world, right? And we share it. We bring it out into life, into the air, and into what it is to be human. And so I really love this. What I also know is that thinking about modern psychology, there's actually a term for this. And this is something that comes up at bereavement groups that we talk about all the time. This is the Jewish language for it. This question, I think, of gathering, or if someone's memory being a blessing, of somebody still being alive. I think a modern psychological understanding of this same idea is there's something called continuing bonds theory. About the idea that we integrate loss into our life. The bond doesn't end. We're not letting go. And that's okay. And I think the challenge is we live in a society that's constantly telling us we have to work through grief. Grief ends, right? There's an end date. Somebody's gone, they're gone. But instead, I think what I hear over and over again from people wrestling and struggling with the loss of a loved one, instead is, how do I integrate that loss into my life? How do I make meaning from it? And what is that ongoing connection with the person that I've loved? I don't want to let go. And in fact, I think that as we really think about healthy loss and grief, and what Judaism is maybe saying here, is we're not being asked to. We're being asked instead to figure out, where does this person continue to fit within our life? What do they mean to us now? What did we learn from them? And it's not just if we have children, but in thinking about how we process the death of prophets or great people in the world. What do we do with that loss? What's the legacy of what they've left us? And so I think it's this beautiful Jewish teaching that in so many ways is very compatible with what is it to be to be somebody who's experienced loss in the world today. So I love this continuing bonds theory, and for me personally, it resonates very deeply. So to review for a moment about sort of what we've looked at so far, actually, because it's been a lot, thinking about what Judaism is handing us when it comes to thinking about loss. First, the idea that time's precious and not guaranteed. That in an ideal situation, can we actually talk about our death? Can we gather what matters, whether it's people or repair or to give instructions or to bless? And I think the third piece that at least I pulled today that is an emphasis is that the relationship is not at an end. Maybe our bodies physically die, but we do continue on. And what does that mean? And what do we do with that knowledge now, knowing that? How do we convey what we hope or dream of can continue? And then what do we do with our own losses in our life? How do we integrate them into our own meaning making about who we are and what the world could be? So those are our first three principles. We have two more that we actually will get to. And so the first is a little bit of a longer text, and it brings us to a question of ethics, knowing that in the spring we're going to spend a lot more time on ethics just because this is a huge conversation. And so again, from the Talmud, it's related that on the day that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died, the sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die. And they said, anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi has died will be stabbed with a sword. That's a visceral reaction, right? This person is not going to die. He was the leader of the Jewish community. That's the other thing to note. He led the people, we're taught, out of the chaos after the destruction of the temple into rabbinic Judaism, into this new system. However, the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi ascended to the roof and said, the upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will upon the upper worlds. However, when she saw how he was suffering with his intestinal disease, she said, may it be the will of God that the upper worlds should impose their will upon the lower worlds. And the sages, meanwhile, would not be silent. They would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi would not die. So she took the jug, and threw it from the roof to the ground. Due to the sudden noise, we can imagine that smashing sound, right? The sages were momentarily silent and refrained from begging and praying for mercy. And it was in that moment, we're taught, that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi died. So much here, right? Like, it's really kind of this unbelievable thing. So what do you do with this, right? There's a few questions we can ask. We can ask mine, you can ask your own. Why a maidservant? Why was silence necessary? Right? And the question of principle or denial versus the face of real suffering, the choices that we might have to make. But for yourself, I'm curious, thinking about this, what do you do with this text? How do you understand it? How do you hold it? And again, this gets us into a conversation around ethics that's miles deep, and this is a few minutes. So just know that I know that there's so many places that we can go. Anyone want to raise their hand or put in the chat? Where do you hold this? Amy, your hand's up.
It reminds me, I was the law librarian for Klamath County, and I was the one to hand out the end of life, what you want to do if you get caught in an accident and somebody's got to decide, should they pull the plug or not? It's a very difficult decision for families.
Yes, it is. It's impossible sometimes, right, to know what to do. Carol's saying that time comes when we do have to actually let go. And when is that moment, right? Is it selfish to want a person to stay alive if they're suffering? I see Lissa, who hasn't shared yet, and then Annette.
Just a quick story, and I won't do it justice, but I work at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and years ago had a client whose wife had dementia, and he was deeply religious and couldn't make the decision to just kind of move her into palliative care, hospice care, and not do major interventions. And I was working with a neurologist who was Jewish and could really kind of connect to the dilemma of this deeply religious husband. And he shared something from a Jewish text. I can't tell you what it was, but it was so helpful. It was something about if there's somebody cutting down wood in the forest, and while Jews can't actively bring on death, that if this woodsman would silence his saw, that then it would be okay for this woman to choose to die. And I'm wondering if it's kind of from this moment of silence, and it was such a brilliant intervention that allowed this man to kind of take the next step and, remove all of the life-sustaining equipment that he was, using for his wife. But it's really so interesting to think of how in our own lives we fill things with so much activity and noise and talk and chatter that there's something about the space of silence and how therapeutic it can be. Anyway, I'm delighted to see this because it takes me back to that intervention from so many years ago.
Really compassionate physician too. And I think Abby shared that it's amazing that it was the maidservant, the woman with the least power in the situation, right, saw it and helped to end his suffering. That she did what must be done. I think this also brings up questions: who determines suffering, right, and how much is and what does that mean, right? And head versus heart speaking, that we want to hold on to someone we love. And at what point do we make a decision to let go? These are so difficult. There's a Jewish concept. And again, this is the type of thing we'll go far more in depth and talk about things like assisted aid in dying and questions around the ethics of that and what does Judaism have to say in the longer class. A person who's actively dying is recategorized. They have an interesting status. They're called a goses. And there's all sorts of laws and rules about who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do when somebody is in that phase. But ultimately, I think the question we ask around someone who is a goses, are we helping them to live, or are we preventing somebody from dying? And where is that line, and how do we determine that and reach that moment? And then what is it that Judaism instructs us to do? And we see here that there is a halakha, there's a piece of law about you can remove impediments to death, but you can't actually hasten a death. And so what's the difference? And in particular, this was around a question of a loud noise. There's so much nuance to all of this. So not simple. And so then I'm going to invite, and then I'm sorry to jump over. I want to make sure that people who haven't had a chance to share do, but I'd love for you, I really would love for you to share. So if you want to put in the chat, I'll read it off. And Karen, if you want to jump in.
This statement reminds me of when my mom was in her last hours of living. We wanted to gather the nieces and my sister and myself around her, and we swear that she held on until we were all there and we gave her permission to go. Because once we were all around her and we said, it's time, we don't want you to suffer, go back to your mom and dad and your brother and daddy and, all of that. She took a deep breath and she passed. And this whole thing is we, with our selfishness, wanted her to stay living. And yet, once we were all there, we wanted to end her suffering and allowed her to go. And she took that allowance and went. And I think this statement addresses that.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so powerful. I felt very privileged in my career to be with people towards the end of life. And what I find so meaningful sometimes under, again, ideal circumstances is that we can stand around a person's bed and say, we love you, and it's okay to let go. That's an incredible, hard thing to do. And it's a gift too, that we can sometimes give in certain circumstances. But yeah, I think too, Annette is saying the rabbis were there in this intellectual space, right? It was an intellectual exercise, but meanwhile, the caregiver or a maidservant, right, sees is about relationship. And so, it's again, this head versus heart. We know what we know intellectually may not always be what the right choice emotionally is. This is some of the hardest moments I think that we experience in life, right? And again, I think somebody also in the chat said this is where having the conversations about what it is that we do want before a crisis really does matter. There are unbelievable tools out there these days too that can help us to do that can be a frame so we're not by ourselves sort of floating in the dark about how do I even bring up something I don't have vocabulary for. But if anybody has ever experienced moments like that, they're profound and remarkable and hard. And so Again, a quick review. What are some of these principles? Again, we're looking at time's precious. Let's have those conversations that matter. What does the relationship look like after someone's gone? And then this question of ethics that we hold on with love, we release with love, and how do we do that as well as we possibly can? Knowing that circumstances may conspire against us, but really, you know, how do we create case scenarios where we can do these things? And again, I'm thinking about if this is when someone has a timely death as well. The last piece of text, I think, is maybe the hardest on some level today, but because it's about mourning and grief, and how do we mourn and grieve. And so I'm gonna read it to us, and we'll take some time as well to respond. So the proof text, the first text here, comes from the Talmud again, and then we're going to look at a contemporary response in just a moment, and that's the one we'll spend the most time on. And so we read, "It happened that a certain woman, a neighbor of Rabban Gamliel, whose son died, she would cry over him at night. Rabban Gamliel heard her voice and cried along with her until his eyelashes fell out. The next day, his students noticed, and they removed her from the neighborhood." Okay. So, I'm not sure I like this text very much, or at least I didn't when I first read it. What do you think? Why did the students remove her? What's the problem here? What's going on? Feels very unfinished, right? And you know, of course, we're going to look at a response, so we're going to finish it in some ways, but just this literally is a standalone in the Talmud. What do you do with it? And it's okay if you don't like it. And your response is, "I really don't like this," as well. What's the significance of losing one's eyelashes? Great question. To help him not to grieve, right? Susie does not like this text. You can't help others unless you put your oxygen mask on first. Carol, that's very, very thoughtful. And yes, that he's so deeply in there with her that he's then not able to offer her the support she needs. Yeah, the students want more intellect, right? They're running away from the emotion of this. We don't want our teacher to be emotional. We need him to give us the intellectual grounding to process even what's happened. That it can be hard for us to witness such deep emotion. Sometimes we run away. I think, again, we're living in a society that says we give you a certain amount of time to mourn. Maybe it's the 2 bereavement days off that you get, you know, as a part of your work package, and then you're supposed to be right back at it. And if you're not able to pick yourself up again so quickly, you know, you're outside the camp. Yep, community and mourning, Mary Jane. And Mary Jane, I've had a lot of privilege of studying with a lot of you. Mary Jane often gets to the heart of it. We'll see in a moment. So I'm not a fan of this text, admittedly. I first read it and just on so many levels found it awful. Although I think that the one piece around that, you know, we need people in the world who have the presence of mind to then be the supporter, to be the one who can support in the midst of such great depth of grief. And to be the non-anxious presence also. That is, I think, also we need those people in our lives. So what are we going to do with this? So where I'm going to take you is to a comment, a response to this story. That's a hard one. Leora Ayalon is a member of Kibbutz Kfar Aza. It was one of the kibbutzim destroyed on October 7th. She lost her son that day. And she and a friend of hers actually have been, since October 7th, writing midrashim, writing responses, and writing what we call kinot, lamentations about what has happened to them, and using Jewish texts and language to try to put words to the impossible. And so she actually had a lot to say about this Talmudic text and about grief. and what we do with it. And so I wanted to read her midrash, her response to what the rabbis had to say. And so we know the context here. She's a mother, right? And she's crying out, we can assume. Why did they remove her from his neighborhood? The rabbi student said, because his eyelashes fell out, and it was because he was crying alone. His neighbors did not hear him crying and did not cry along with him for that neighbor who lost her child. The students removed her that she would stir about in the world, going from one neighborhood to another, crying for her son, and her voice would be like a shofar that sounds from one end of the earth to another, calling out, cry, you will cry in the night, for you are the community of Israel. And so Rabban Gamliel will not cry alone for her in the night, but the people of his community and all the communities will cry along with them, and the sorrow will diminish a little in the world. And since she stirred about in their neighborhoods, the people cried along with her, and their tears cleansed their souls. And so her mind eased a little, and she found some respite for her soul. This is a tough text. What do you think? What are your responses? What about, tell me more in your mind about the shofar in particular. I think that's such a visceral, vivid image here. Anyone want to share, either in the chat or raise your hand? How do you respond to this? Karen.
So here, this is a quick thought because I'm just reading it now for the first time, but I think it's that we all have, it's our job to all share in the loss and grief of this woman's losing her son. And it reminds me of, like, I've always understood the rules around Shiva are you go, you just go. And so why you're there to comfort, and just your presence comforts the people, the family who've lost a family member. And so I feel like maybe joining in the crying and being with the mom, it's the same theme or another angle of the same theme.
Absolutely. The shofar is calling us, right, to wake up, to see the suffering that's around us, and to be compassionate. I love that, Carol. That in the wider world would be a greater mourning. Yep. And the weight is not on just one person to mourn. I love that one person's mourning is not enough. The students, this was about expanding grief and us holding it together. I think about the image of the mourner's Kaddish, right? Our job, right, is to always say amen, that we're saying, I affirm your grief. You don't stand there by yourself, right? And that we carry this load, this question of our own mortality, of loss, of death, of all these things, we carry it together. I think the question that we ask here is what happens when all of us are the ones reciting Kaddish? I think about October 7th, right? And is it just this proliferation of amens that we say amen to one another and we carry it together? I think and I think that the ultimate piece at the very end, that Leora shares, she found some respite. And ultimately, when other people say amen to our Kaddish, where I want to propose to is this a continuation, a belief that there's hope, that we put these words out there into the ether. Someone in our community says amen, and we feel respite, that we feel a hope that the future can be different because there's somebody there saying amen for us and with us. And that's our obligation ultimately to one another. It's pretty profound. It's hard. So, I before we do sort of what did we do today, I do want to put out there that Brueggemann is a Christian theologian, but I just think that this statement is so beautiful, that our prophetic task in a culture of denial is to embrace, model, and practice grief in order that death and the real losses in our lives can be acknowledged. And that knowing, again, we're in a world that gives us 2 bereavement days off and says you're supposed to be back at it. No, can we fight against that and say that loss, grief, death, all of this is a process that goes on continuously. And that our job is to continue to say amen when people express or feel needs or share or need our love and care and support. So what did we look at today? Because we went on this huge journey in a very short amount of time, right? All of these Jewish lenses around time is precious. What are things we can do under the best of circumstances? We gather what matters. Our relationship continues. We do think about ethics and in an ideal situation, what we want most at the end, and that grieving is a communal act, that it's a constant act. And that actually, when we grieve as a community, it's an expression of hope. It's an expression that because we grieve together, perhaps we can see light. We can create a better world by this abundance of empathy that doesn't always exist in the world in which we find ourselves. Some of these ideas may resonate more or less for you. Some of them you may find easier or harder, or things that you can follow through on for yourself that don't feel like a heavy burden. And then others that when we think about what's our responsibility to each other are not simple to do. And so this is just the opening, the beginning of a much longer, deeper, harder conversation, of course. But I hope you walk away with some different takeaways for yourself about what matters most as we think about our lives, as we think about finitude and we think about the end, knowing we don't always like to do that. And so I know I can't believe I brought it in at 12:59. But the last image I want to leave you with again is that what does it mean to grow in wisdom? I think it means to continually be part of this ongoing conversation about, I hope, what Judaism can give and mean for each of us as we process what it is to live good lives and live in the best of possible ways. And actually, in some cases, it is thinking about the end. If you want to be in touch, if this triggered anything for you, I know there's so much more conversation to be had. I'm going to put my email in the chat. This is my JFCS email. Please reach out. You're not alone if this did bring things up. I'd love for you to join the class in the spring. I'm here if you want to think more about loss and bereavement as well. It's my work in the community. It's deeply, deeply meaningful. And I'm just grateful to all of you who shared and were here. And it's good to spend time learning together. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before you all go, I just want to thank Rabbi Berry for this. This was amazing, an amazing session, and I hope you all got a lot out of it like I did. I just put in the chat the registration link for Journey of the Soul, Jewish Wisdom on Death and Dying, the class that Rabbi Berry's been referring to, which starts on April 28th. It is an in-person class at Hebrew College. And also just to let you know that next month, March 11th, we have another Grow session with Rabbi Matthew Ponik talking about From Harvest to Healing, Kabbalah, and the Counting of the Omer. So with that, I wish you all a great day, and thank you for coming. And we will be sending this out.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone.